Morning, bon dia. I'm Jason Marzak, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. Bem-vindos y obrigado por participarem desta importante conversa sobre democracia no Brasil. I'll now switch to English, but we remind everyone that we do have translation from English into Portuguese and Portuguese into English throughout this conversation. Today, September 15th, is an incredibly symbolic day to be having this conversation. The world celebrates International Day of Democracy, resolved by the UN General Assembly in 2007 to promote and uphold democratic principles. However, since then, according to Freedom House, the world has experienced 16 consecutive years of democratic decline. As the title of today's conversation states, this global trend of questioning of democratic principles and even backsliding of democratic freedom in some places is incredibly concerning. For Brazil, even with its incredibly strong institutions, the election and its aftermath present an opportunity to even further strengthen the overall democratic system amid global democratic headwinds. Today's discussion will shed light on the current state of Brazilian democracy ahead of consequential elections. Importantly, we also look at actionable responses and longer-term policies to preserve and fortify democracy, which can be applicable for Brazil and further beyond. With the support of Action for Democracy, I also invite you to read our newest publication being launched today, titled Democratic Institutional Strength Ahead and Beyond Elections, The Case of Brazil. It's authored by my colleague, Valentina Seder, and it presents the product of a highly insightful private strategy session that we held here in July with senior Brazilian, US, and international experts, as well as former policymakers and practitioners of democracy. We'll hear from some of them directly today during this conversation over the next hour and a half, and we'll also hear from other experts in Brazil and from the international community. You can access this brief in the Zoom chat for those joining us via Zoom, and we also invite you to follow the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag ACBrazil, and you can also use that to send in questions during today's conversation. I'd now like to pass it to David Karani, the Board President, Executive Director at Action for Democracy, and also a former Atlantic Council colleague, and also thank him for his support and partnership of this project. I'd also like to take a moment to also thank the Brazilian Center for International Relations, SEBRI, for their institutional partnership. David, over to you.
Thank you, Jason. It's good to be back. It's good to be home. This was my home for 6 years, and it's just a fantastic feeling to be back again. As some of you know, I'm Hungarian, and you might ask, what is a Hungarian doing trying to sustain or help sustain Brazilian democracy? Well, it's a fair question, and despite the distance and the many differences between the two countries, there are also many similarities. The democratic journey for both of our countries resumed in the late 1980s, and in both of our countries, democratic institutions, checks and balances, the rule of law recently faced some serious challenges, if not existential attacks. And this is not only true in Brazil and Hungary, as Jason outlined, but it's in many other democracies in the world. And indeed, this is why we established Action for Democracy to help counter this rising threat on a global scale. Because these are not isolated tendencies, but they are closely connected and they reinforce each other, and increasingly on the institutional, personal, and even financial level. Thus, we cannot really be effective in fighting back if we are fragmented ourselves. So Action for Democracy, for that reason, is building a global grassroots solidarity movement to help reinforce pro-democracy actors on the ground in what we call battleground states. Battleground states, there are countries, due to their size, regional importance, or for some other reason, key for the global democracy, the global struggle for democracy. And these are countries such as Poland, such as Hungary, such as Turkey, such as Brazil, of course. With the help of our community, we support frontline democratic organizations and advocate for robust pro-democracy policies in key capitals such as Washington, D.C. And although we are a young organization, we are very honored to have an advisory council that consists of household names in the global democracy promotion, people like Anne Applebaum, Cathy Morton, Francis Fukuyama, Timothy Snyder, Timothy Garton Ash, or David Miliband. So to finish up, Brazil undoubtedly is a key piece in the global democratic puzzle, and how Brazil goes will have a major impact on whether democracy thrives or fails in the continent and beyond, not to mention the ability on the impact on our ability to tackle major global challenges such as climate change. And we have been honored and we were very excited to help facilitate this dialogue together with the Atlantic Council, and we were very happy to support the report as well. So thank you, Jason, and thank you for the Council for the partnership.
Thanks so much, David, and great to, as you said, great to have you back here at home in the new Atlantic Council studios, and also a special welcome to our in-studio audience as well. Thanks for joining us here in person, as well as all those here joining us virtually. Now, for the first part of the conversation, I'd like to welcome four fantastic speakers. Ambassador Anthony Harrington, Miriam Kornblith is here to my side, Nick Zimmerman and Patricia Campos-Melo. We'll talk about global democratic challenges and how countries and democratic institutions can be proactive in further strengthening their democracy given the many global challenges and global democratic headwinds we're seeing. I'm going to go ahead and just briefly introduce our speakers. Joining us via video, Ambassador Harrington is Managing Board Chair at Albright Stonebridge Group, where he leads the group's Americas practice. During the Clinton administration, he also served as U.S. Ambassador to Brazil, among the many other posts that he has had. So, Tony, great to have you join us today. Sitting to my side here is Miriam Kornblith. Miriam, great to have you here in studio. Miriam is the Senior Director for Latin America and the Caribbean at the National Endowment for Democracy. She works at an organization, incredible organization that supports and advocates for freedom, democracy all across the world. Miriam, great to have you here today.
Thank you. Great.
Also joining via video is Nick Zimmerman. Nick is a global fellow at the Wilson Center's Brazil Institute and also a senior advisor at West Eck Advisors. He also served as director for Brazil and Southern Cone Affairs at the NSC. Nick, great to have you here today. We're also joined by Patricia Campos-Melo. Patricia is a senior fellow with the Brazilian Center for International Relations, SEBRI, and a special reporter and columnist at the Brazilian newspaper Folha de Sao Paulo. Patricia, good morning. Great to have you too. I also wanted, before we go ahead and get started, I want to give also a special thank you to Miriam and Patricia, who are both acknowledged in the policy brief that we are launching today for their support and contributions to that effort. Tony, I'm going to go ahead and start with you. You and I have talked about how democracy is under strain worldwide. I'd like to have you start out by explaining what you see as some of the factors that can explain some of the recent challenges that democracy has faced globally, and also how did these factors come about?
Thank you, Jason, and congratulations to the Adrienne Arsht Center and the Atlantic Council overall for the priority attention you're giving to the major concern for preserving, strengthening democracy in Brazil and ultimately beyond. As you noted, I was privileged to represent the U.S. and Brazil, and what I would have to say were better times there and here, enhanced by serving with that great Fernando Henrique Cardoso as president, really extraordinary leader, scholar, and public servant, and enjoyed the benefits of a close personal relationship between Presidents Cardoso and Clinton and their distinguished spouses. The troubled global landscape that you referred to, Jason, it seemed a little like a perfect storm, although perfect has never sounded like the right adjective for storms.
Doesn't.
We're all quite aware of the factors, I think, but just to reflect on them a bit, we have an unexpected and devastating war underway with devastating consequences for the battleground, but also devastating consequences rippling out from it. We have unanticipated pandemic that has uprooted normal conduct of business and exchange and so forth. I think we're all observing increased polarization around the world. And in this case, not just Brazil, but we're seeing it here at home in the US. Increasing presence of autocrats, autocratic leaders. Some of you will remember, and hopefully some have read my colleague, Secretary Albright's, can't remember if it was our last book, but one of her last books, Fascism, A Warning, which at the time was really quite prophetic in thinking about what would or could come. Then all of this has produced a combination of cultural alienation, I think, personal alienation, but also associated economic challenges, especially as we hear so much inflation and the cost of living. And then sort of an overlay of all of this on the global stage of the world, climate as an existential threat. I'm increasingly worried on the one hand about the effects of climate on the planet and my grandkids, but also increasingly thinking that recent devastating climate events are beginning to rally leaders and citizens to realize we have to take serious steps and are on the march to do so.
So Tony, I'm going to go ahead and jump in there. So there's war, polarization, autocracy, economic challenges, climate. We're doing a lot of work here through our Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center on heat and paying attention to extreme heat. You also make a really important point about alienation, cultural alienation, personal alienation, and how that has been fomented even more so by the communication channels in which people receive and share information these days.
Yeah.
We have really these multiple factors that are coming at democracies. I mentioned the statistic in the beginning from Freedom House. And Miriam, you obviously know the case of Brazil really well, but at NED you're looking all across democracies around the world. What do you see as some of the similarities, some of the differences as well between the challenges that in democracy that Brazil is facing, as other countries are facing, and Brazil in particular as it's coming into an election in a few weeks, but also those similarities with other cases that you might be seeing, whether it's in the Americas, Europe, Asia, Africa. What else? Is some of the challenges Brazil is facing right now, is that similar to what NED is seeing in other parts of the world, or is it slightly different in the Brazilian case?
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Again, it's a pleasure to be here. Well, obviously, Brazil is very unique, but on the other hand, Brazil shares a lot of common trends that have already been described by Ambassador Harrington and yourself. I would say that Brazil has a very strong democracy indeed. It fought hard to gain this democracy after a very difficult history, and has strong institutions. However, we've seen in the past decade, and that's been reported by Freedom House, a decay in some indicators, relevant indicators. There was, pretty, recognition, a strong recognition of the strength of the judiciary in Brazil, the way it dealt with the Lava Jato, the scandal. However, we've also seen most recently a hyper-politicization of the judiciary, which is a very worrisome trend in regards to the strength of democracy. On the other hand, Brazil has a strong party system, and globally we are seeing how party systems and parties are falling apart, or they're unable to really channel people's interests and desires and represent adequately people. But that party system too is weakening. Brazil has a highly decentralized system, which can be very positive, but this hyper decentralization is also generating a lot of difficulty to reach agreements. There are lots of partial agreements at local level and state level, which are also creating pockets of clientelism and opportunities for corruption.
Yeah.
So those are, I would say, some very particular, say, challenges that Brazil faces. And in addition to that, something that's pretty global, the increase in polarization, a very contaminated digital space. There's also a growth in what we call identity politics that also presents challenges in terms of aggregating interests and channeling these, say, societal choices. And unfortunately, in the last couple of years, we have seen an attempt to delegitimize the electoral system, which is increasing, it's incredibly strong, but that kind of discourse can have a very deleterious effect, as we have seen here in the US and elsewhere. So Brazil shares some common traits and also has its own specificities that make us and Brazilians be concerned about the future and the strength of democracy in the country.
Yeah. I mean, there's global trends from, I'll call them the anti-democratic crusaders that you see in countries around the world. As you mentioned, the questioning of political parties, the questioning of the system, the way in which information is received or transmitted. But of course, as you mentioned, the particular challenges that Brazil faces within this broader global context. Nick, Miriam mentioned the United States, and of course we can't talk about democracy and questioning of the democratic system and threats to democracy without recognizing the own challenges that we have in this country. What do you see as some of the shared challenges for democracy between our two countries, and also not just challenges, but I always like to look in the future. What can we learn from each other? What can both the U.S. and Brazil be learning from these shared global challenges? Of course, taking into account the specificity of the Brazil case, as democracies are being questioned globally.
Sure. Thank you for the invite, Jason, and the question. It's always a pleasure to be with you. I've enjoyed working with you over the years and have missed the opportunity to do so in these pandemic times. I think, quite simply and broadly, the challenges and opportunities are both vast. We're talking about two of the world's 5 largest democracies. So if we are going to see some sort of a coordinated global campaign to take this issue set on and have a multilateral component to it, I think for any such effort to have any chances of success, you need to have Washington and Brasilia at the table because of influence, because of size, because of the vibrancy of both countries' democratic institutions and the threats that they face, some of which are very similar, some of which are distinct to their own political realities. In many ways, relative to my time serving in government several years ago, there are, of course, through lines, but the context is very new. The polarization that has so deeply marked the political discourse in both countries was really just kicking off while I was in government. And I think it's radically reshaped bilateral dynamics, mostly in a challenging way up until now. But also, to your point, I think it opens up some opportunities if we're looking over the midterm horizon for new areas of collaboration, democracy obviously being one of them. But I think
we lost Nick's sound. Nick, Nick, we lost your sound as we're working on that. I'm going to move on to Patricia. Patricia, one of the factors that we were talking about with Tony and Miriam and Nick got to this as well is how the media has been impacted as well by this growing wave of democracy being under assault. In what ways do you see that journalists, civil society actors, and others have shown kind of resilience in this context?
Well, thank you. I would like to thank Action for Democracy and the Atlantic Council for having this conversation. I think more than the effects on journalists and on civil society, there's an effect on the information ecosystem in Brazil. What we are seeing here on the ground is basically the polls indicate that it's going to be a very tight election, even though there was hope that it could be resolved in the first round. That is not a very high probability. And this is actually perfect for the coming storm that we are foreseeing, which is disputing the results of the election. We have at the same time attacks against mainstream respected polling institutes, against the mainstream media and the civil society, and all to develop this narrative that actually the polling institutes are either wrong or hyper-partisan. That's why they do not have President Bolsonaro leading the polls. The media is, of course, also lying, and the civil society also wants to undermine the will of the people. So I think the biggest challenge for the media and for civil society is how are we going to maintain, actually, how are we going to face if there's civic unrest, which there is a high probability that is going to happen, because for a part of the population, President Bolsonaro is leading in the polls, and he should win in the first round. And if he does not, that is the proof that the elections have been rigged. This is a very, it's not the majority of the population, but as you guys know, you have seen, it's really enough to cause a lot of unrest. And also, regardless of the results of the elections, we might end up with a big portion of the population, just like in the US, I guess, 70% of the Republicans who do not believe that the election results were legitimate in 2020. We might also end up with a part of the population also not trusting the system and trusting the institutions. And how do we either, whoever wins the election, how is this person going to govern with a part of the population not believing in the institutions? I think this is a big challenge, Jason.
And Patricia, this is a challenge that we're seeing globally, right? This is a challenge. This is a trend of you mentioned the U.S. case, but there's other cases around the world of the population not necessarily believing in the results of the electoral authorities. And so how does a leader govern in that dynamic? I want to go back to Miriam. Miriam, in the 2021 Latino Barometer survey, a number of Latin American countries reported that anywhere between 30 to 40% of citizens were indifferent. They were indifferent as to whether they prefer living in a democracy or a dictatorship. Part of that goes to just wanting to have a government that delivers for their basic needs, regardless of what type of government it is. What explains, from your perspective, authoritarianism's increasing allure, and what are some of the selling points for democracy in this moment of discontent that we can further build upon in this moment?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, Jason. Well, of course, we need to read those answers and also understand that for many, democracy is a given. So it's easy to say we would prefer something else that is, better or delivers better, whether it's called authoritarianism or something else. I think that what it's really expressing is the desire to have a better system. Maybe not necessarily an authoritarian system, but something that's different, because nowadays democracy has been identified with failures and inefficiencies. But there's also a very worrisome aspect to those kind of answers, which is for some there is a clear preference for a non-democratic regime, and that I think it's the result of all the trends that we have been discussing so far. Very misinformation, lack of information, a very polluted digital space, the allure that many individuals, populist leaders are having, the debacle of the political system that are not providing the answers.
So what's the step forward then? What do we do? What do we do about that?
I mean, first, I think we have to go basically back to basics in the sense of reinforcing the connection between access to basic goods and services through a regime that allows for contestation, for feedback, for knowledge, for accountability. Because without those elements, I mean, there's no possibility that a authoritarian regime will deliver for the people, and that's the case for Latin America. And I think civil society in this case plays a huge role for, addressing the different aspects of democracy and highlighting them and giving them visibility and bringing them to the discussion, to the public discussion, because we know maybe political figures have lost a lot of their legitimacy, but in the case of Latin America, civil society has a strong legitimacy, and I think that's a dynamic aspect of the region that needs to be taken into account and encouraged more.
You know that firsthand from all the great work that Ned does with civil society around the region. You know, it's all about democracy, showing that democracy has been talked about in the U.S. Democracy delivers, and showing that democracy delivers. We're looking globally, regionally, but things like the Alliance for Development and Democracy between Costa Rica, Panama, Dominican Republic, now Ecuador, really focused on how democracies can work together to solve concrete problems, concrete challenges that citizenry faces. I'm going to go back to Tony in a moment, but first, Nick, your audio stopped working before, and so I see you're back on. Let me go back to you to allow you to finish your point on U.S., Brazil, and shared lessons learned.
Thanks, Jason, and my apologies for the audio. I think it's the casualty of being the son of a philosophy professor of technology, always bedevils me. At a high level, I think that there are a number of challenges and opportunities in the relationship, and in many ways, I think that there are both more opportunities and more challenges given the polarized political environment that Brazil, the United States, and countries really around the world are facing. Figuring out how we can work together to, as Miriam was just alluding, and yourself, how to make democracy deliver better, use technology, innovation, up our game on services delivery, I think is a ripe area for discussion and collaboration. How to break through some of the barriers that countries such as the United States have been facing in terms of delivering again, the possibilities of socioeconomic mobility that characterized past decades of economic life in the United States, and for that matter in Brazil, and the not too far distant past as well. Other areas like climate change, the challenge itself has only become more pressing since I left government. Brazil and the United States had started to lead on these issues in the run up to Paris. I think that as the problem has only gotten worse, as we've just witnessed in the United States over our summer, and as we continue to see record rates of deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon and other geographically significant regions of Brazil beyond just its Amazon basin, I think there's a new energy and willingness to work on these issues together as well. And of course, in polarized times, with sides talking past each other, in a new era of rising great power competition, I think there'll be new tensions as well. And frankly, none of that is particularly surprising, and even if the details are specific to the time. Again, when you're talking about 2 of the 5 largest democracies in the world, there are going to be a lot of points of common interest and a lot of divergences, as there are in Washington's relationships with some of the other largest countries in the world. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Nick. That's really helpful. And I want to remind everybody watching via Zoom, if you have a question, feel free to put it in the Zoom chat, and we'll get it over to me or to Valentina in the next panel. And if you're here in the in-studio audience, you can also write your question down, and it'll get to me as well. Tony, Nick talked about innovation, and we got to innovate the way that we work as democracies, and especially with the many global challenges that we've been discussing. Miriam as well, and talking about the importance of democracy and showing that it works, that it's really that's the correct system for people's needs. Brazil is cited as oftentimes as a model of democratic resilience and reconstruction, Tony, particularly after the military dictatorship ended in the 80s, and the electoral system is also renowned worldwide. From your perspective, what are some of the institutional innovations in Brazil that the world can learn from? And also, what are some of the ways in which Brazil could even further lead in democratic innovation?
Get off mute here. Yes, there's more than a little irony involved in the situation that we're discussing and facing. The electoral system in Brazil has been for a few years now cited as a model worldwide for a modern and reliable electoral process. And fortunately, recent polling has indicated that the majority of Brazilians trust the election process. So hopefully the trust will prevail. And as we've seen, Brazilian democracy has emerged from the military dictatorship and had peaceful transitions of power, election after election. And even with 2 impeachments of Brazilian presidents, they've gone, the orderly transfer of power has gone forward. And in fact, the constitutional process in Brazil, the Brazilian constitution is pretty complicated, but the constitutional process related to elections is simpler than our own here in the US, as we have unfortunately seen too up close. But apart from the constitutional order, we have seen Brazilians speaking out, civil society, business, and finance. So as people have probably heard, seen, observed, early on there was a statement by 3,000 leading business and financial principles regarding the importance of democracy in Brazil and avoidance of a rupture in conjunction with the elections underway. Organizations such as SEBRI, participating here today, Federation of Industry of Sao Paulo, the largest by far state industry association, and FEBRABAN also have spoken out. And then there was a letter on which close to 1 million persons signed, I believe, including the great Fernando Henrique Cardoso as one of those signatories. So things are working, and in terms of the 3 powers, the courts, both the Supreme Court and the Electoral Court, unfortunately, there's been a politicization, as Miriam, I think, noted, of the judicial process, but nevertheless, the courts have risen to the test. It's kind of reaching places that you would hope they wouldn't need to go or be, but providing leadership and institutional strength that is needed. There's a rather assertive Congress in Brazil, and it's not going anywhere. It's going to be there after the election. Whoever wins will find some challenge to that important relationship. So ultimately, I think we have to count on the good people of Brazil who will be casting their votes. And it seems that, again, according to the polling, the younger citizens and the older citizens are more concerned than those in the middle. So I think it's always good news when younger voters are concerned and thus inspired to do what they can to preserve democratic order.
Tony, those are really, really important points. I want to we have to move on soon to the next panel, but I want to mention two things just to end that come out in the policy brief. A couple of the recommendations in the policy brief that we have launched today. One of them is the importance of the international community. Tony, you were talking, I was asking as well about the innovations from the Brazilian democratic system and the strength and the resilience of the Brazilian democracy and the Brazilian electoral system, which you were speaking about as well, how strong and how and its credibility. One of those recommendations is the fact that the international community should immediately come out and recognize the results that are put out there by the electoral system, so there isn't kind of murkiness and who is, whether the results are agreed to or not, and as well an idea looking even further about potentially the idea of establishment of a U.S.-Brazil dialogue on democracy promotion, given some of the conversation we were having earlier. Nick, you were talking about this as well, the shared challenges that we have and also the opportunities to learn from each other. Patricia, you're joining us from Brazil. What do you think about some of these ideas?
I think the idea of recognizing the results right away, it's actually an excellent idea, and it would be really helpful in terms of helping support the electoral authorities in Brazil and helping with a counter narrative if we do have contested results. So I think this would be really important. And I think the US government, they have been sort of verbalizing this message after the meeting in July when President Bolsonaro convened several ambassadors in Brasilia. In a few hours, the U.S. embassy and several other embassies said, we trust electoral systems in Brazil. Elections have been clean and trustworthy for many, many years. And I think this movement of the international community and mainly the U.S. government is very helpful to Brazilian institutions in such a fragile moment that we are living.
I agree, Patricia. You're looking at, there's always a challenge in trying to put the U.S. on the wrong side or the wrong footing before a major election, and the U.S. government has been doing an incredible job in navigating the potential treacherous waters, but being very firm and clear on the importance of the electoral system and the belief in the strength of the electoral system, which is, of course, the right message. Miriam, you're here with me in studio, so I'll give you an opportunity to have a final comment on some of the ideas you were also participated in some of the ideas behind the policy brief we launched today. Also, maybe the idea of the U.S.-Brazil dialogue on democracy promotion. How do you see something like that potentially transpiring?
Yeah, well, what can I say? I think the title of this conversation is Looking at the Elections and Beyond, something along those lines. And I think, of course, Brazil is facing a risky moment. I mean, we all know that there have been attempts to undermine the credibility of the elections, and that entails many risks in terms of recognizing the results, and the sequence is pretty well known, and it can be dangerous. But assuming that could be overcome well, and whoever wins, I think we still need to look at challenges ahead. Brazil has gone through a difficult period in at least this past 10 years. There have been, institutions have suffered from these difficult periods, a lot of political turmoil, a lot of real significant corruption scandals, the breakdown of the party system. So beyond elections, without overlooking the relevance of these elections, there is a lot of concern in terms, or a lot of need for attention beyond elections. And I think the U.S.-Brazil partnership and partnership among democracies, I think that's the message that David presented with his initial remarks. I mean, democracies globally, and particularly in the Americas, need to coalesce, need to find common ground, need to recognize the threats against democracy and the clear decline of democracy globally. And we need to coalesce and raise the allure, the relevance, and also the ability of democracies to deliver properly, because that's part of the problem.
Yeah. Well, hopefully with all the attention that we at the Atlantic Council and others are placing on the importance of democracy and Brazil's democratic institutions, that we'll have an election that's respected by all parties, respected by the electorate, that goes that's peaceful as well, but that we also use this moment of focusing on Brazil to look even longer term, which is so pivotal moving into 2023 as we continue to face these global democratic headwinds. We can, of course, continue the conversation, but we have a second fantastic group of speakers that will be coming up. I want to thank Tony Harrington for joining us, Nick Zimmerman, Patricia, Miriam, thank you so much for joining us here in studio. And now I want to turn over to
Jason, could I add one note?
Sure. Yeah.
One quick note. I just want to recognize Action for Democracy, David Karani and his colleagues for the word action in their name is reflected in their conduct. They're very action-oriented and collaborating with the Atlantic Council and beyond. They're making a real contribution, including having a couple of great colleagues spending time on the ground in Brazil.
Thanks, Tony. Yes, it's great to work with Action for Democracy. I've been trying to find ways to work with David over the years, given the different regional focus, and glad we can come together at this incredibly important moment. So with that, let me turn over to Valentina Sater, Associate Director at the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center, and also who leads our work on Brazil, and she'll continue the conversation. Over to you, Valentina.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, everyone, for this insightful conversation. We're going to continue this conversation with now focusing and going deeper into Brazil. With that, so we can actually talk about these Brazil issues, I also wanted to introduce everyone here. We're joined by an amazing lineup of speakers and experts. Feliciano Guimarães is the Academic Director and Senior Researcher at the Brazilian Center for International Relations, SEBRE, and an Associate Professor at the Institute of International Relations at the University of São Paulo, USP. Welcome, Feliciano. Thank you again to SEBRE for the institutional partnership. I also wanted to welcome Dr. Renata Gil. She is the president of the Association of Brazilian Magistrates, joining us here as well. Bruno Brandão is the Executive Director of Transparency International Brazil. Thank you, Bruno, for joining us. And last but not least, Alana Rizzo. She is the co-founder of Redes Cordiais and the Public Policy Manager at YouTube Brazil. Welcome, Feliciano, Renata, Alana, Bruno. I also invite those joining us via Zoom, as well as those in our studio audience to submit their questions in the chat option on Zoom or via the hashtag #ACBrazil on Twitter. We'll be taking questions if we have time, because I have lots of questions myself. So without further ado, let me begin with Feliciano. Feliciano, the conversation that we had previously already touched on some of these issues, but I wanted to bring it back to the case of Brazil specifically. As we know, there has been increasingly questions over the resilience of Brazilian democracy and the democratic system, and as we mentioned in the previous conversation. Amid global democratic challenges that we were just discussing, how would you evaluate the strength of Brazilian democracy right now? And please provide, if you can, a couple examples of how it's been shown resilient and also how it could be improved. I believe you're on mute, Feliciano.
Oh, I forgot something. I'm sorry. Thank you, Valentina. Good afternoon, everyone. Before I move on to answer your question, I'd like just to say that it's a great pleasure to be here, to be part of this discussion. On behalf of SABRI, I would like to thank the Atlantic Council for its long-standing collaboration with us and Action for Democracy for organizing these panels. And I also would like to give a special thanks to Valentina Seder for her work on the discussions about the Brazilian democracy in the Atlantic Council. Although SABRI has always focused its attention on international relations and foreign policy more recently, and for obvious reasons, the center is also discussing issues concerning the quality and endurance of Brazil's young democratic system and its relationship with foreign policy. So I think the parts that I'm going to try to answer from Valentina's question is the global challenge of democracy and how we can think about Brazil's place in the world and Brazil's foreign policy of Bolsonaro, and also if Lula gets elected, Lula's foreign policy, and how the foreign policy can affect the quality of Brazilian democracy, right? How can the foreign policy be used to weaken or improve Brazil's democratic system? Something that we have been seeing in Bolsonaro's administration. So if Bolsonaro wins, the foreign policy will continue to be used to strengthen and expand his domestic support base, right? More than just achieving foreign policy gains abroad, Bolsonaro's foreign policy is predominantly focused on the domestic political logic of confronting his opponents. For Bolsonaro, the foreign policy is an instrument to attack national democratic institutions. For Bolsonaristas, there is a big clash in the world between conservative regimes and globalist regimes. It is not just a matter between democracies and authoritarian regimes. On the contrary, for them, national identities and values are more important than the shape of political institutions. In this sense, the foreign policy needs to be at the service of this great spiritual struggle for the expansion of conservative values and eventually to implement an interim regime in Brazil in the shape of Putin's Russia. The narrative of warriors of liberty fighting against Brazil's corrupted elite is just a facade for the hidden goal of eliminating globalist and leftist opponents in Brazil. Now, if Lula wins, the foreign policy has a different operating logic. In the place of Brazil in the world will also be different. If Lula is elected, foreign policy will be an instrument for restoring Brazil's international credibility and maintaining Brazil's democratic institutions. But for Lula, the international level also works to satisfy domestic demands, but from a different point of departure. In my view, Lula's foreign policy is, in the next administration, if he wins, will probably seek international agreements and partnerships that increase the cost of any coup or any future attacks on Brazilian democratic institutions. That is, Lula's number one task will be to use Brazil's foreign policy not only to restore the country's credibility on issues such as environment or human rights, but also to assess how Brazil's international action can isolate and penalize Bolsonaro's supporters domestically. In the Workers' Party's view, the foreign policy is likely to serve to create networks of agreements and partnerships that isolate and weaken Bolsonaristas with a view of the 2026 election. So to summarize and to see what the place of Brazil in this global struggle for democracy and how can we think of instruments to improve the quality of democracy in Brazil, I think that the foreign policy of the next administration, whether it's Bolsonaro or Lula, will be a key aspect of how to understand the democracy can survive in Brazil. As anyone can see, this upcoming election is far from solving Brazil's enduring rivalry between the two political groups that are destined to clash for many years to come. But the country's foreign policy is just one pawn on this chessboard that put Brazil's democracy in the rope. So I don't know if I answer your question, but the idea is that in order to understand how democracy will operate in Brazil in the next coming years, whether Bolsonaro or Lula wins, the foreign policy and how Brazil relates itself with other countries, whether it's democratic countries or authoritarian regimes abroad, will be a key aspect, since both candidates will likely use the foreign policy to strengthen their position domestically. So thank you. I give the word back to you. Thank you, Valentina.
Thank you, Feliciano. That's a very interesting point of view in terms of how foreign policy is also being used in terms of strengthening democracy in Brazil, as well as in the other way around, which is what we also think about and propose during this conversation, as well as in the issue brief that we are launching today, how the international community can also support and further support Brazil in its efforts to strengthen its own democratic institutions. With that, Renata, I wanted to turn it to you. As Miriam was actually mentioning earlier, we had the conversation today is focused on the elections, but also beyond the elections. And the focus of the issue brief is also, in that sense, looking ahead beyond the elections on what Brazil can do now, as well as beyond these elections to strengthen its institutions. For many years and recently, we've been seeing and hearing that Brazil is facing an institutional crisis. I think that my question to you as a representative of the judiciary is wondering, how can the judiciary, what's the role of the judiciary in ensuring this balance of power and also ensuring that we have a smooth electoral period ahead of us and then beyond once we do have the next president, whoever that might be?
Então, primeiro eu queria agradecer ao Atlantic Council o convite, dizer que esse tema é muito pertinente, muito importante para nós do Judiciário nesse momento, em que a gente busca exatamente mostrar para a população brasileira que o Judiciário é forte, especialmente o Judiciário eleitoral, que no Brasil tem essa condição de realizar, né, o processo eleitoral brasileiro. Quero cumprimentar aí todos os meus colegas de mesa, pessoas importantes e que têm nos ajudado a passar essa mensagem para a população brasileira. Eu acho que tudo que a gente discute em termos de democracia tem que perpassar primeiro pelo fortalecimento do judiciário e da independência judicial. Todos os retrocessos democráticos que a gente está vivendo e vendo também no mundo, eles têm muita relação com a atuação judicial na manutenção das democracias, né? E o nosso papel é, como foi dito no bloco anterior, é um papel para esse momento e um papel para o momento posterior. A polarização, infelizmente, ela não se encerra quando a eleição termina, né? A gente ainda vai ter um resquício muito forte dessa polarização, quem quer que seja o eleito, talvez em menor ou maior grau, de acordo com quem, né, for eleito e conseguir assumir aí esse legado pós-eleitoral. Eu tenho plena convicção que, com relação às instituições brasileiras, elas estão muito fortes e bem organizadas. Tanto é assim que inúmeros processos legislativos foram engendrados, né, recentemente para mudar a atuação do judiciário brasileiro, e a gente conseguiu fazer essa contenção. Eu acho que esse é o papel mais importante da associação que eu presido hoje, essa associação que tem 72 anos de história, mas a AMB nunca foi tão chamada ao debate democrático como está sendo chamada agora. E a gente tem buscado apoio em outras instituições também para que esse fortalecimento do judiciário seja completo. Então, a sociedade civil organizada tem estado conosco, a OAB Federal, a grande OAB, né, no Brasil, e tantas outras instituições que têm nos dado esse aporte, né, de segurança para enfrentar esse momento em que as instituições estão sendo vergastadas exatamente pelo seu claro e firme posicionamento institucional. Com relação ao judiciário, a gente ainda tem uma questão que o judiciário brasileiro, que é maior, que é o fato de a justiça eleitoral ser conduzida por magistrados e ser conduzida por um magistrado do Supremo Tribunal Federal. Então, isso tudo gera, né, uma complicação maior. Num momento em que o Brasil também já tem um desgaste muito grande institucional no judiciário, porque a política judicializou a política. Então, todas as grandes questões políticas brasileiras estão sendo decididas ou no Supremo Tribunal Federal, ou no Tribunal Superior Eleitoral, ou nos tribunais do país. Isso gera um estressamento e é óbvio que a gente vai sofrer, né, as consequências institucionais desse posicionamento. Mas eu tenho bastante confiança de que nós estamos fortes, isso não é da boca para fora, não é porque eu estou falando aqui num fórum internacional, é porque realmente nós estamos conseguindo fazer com que as decisões proferidas, que são decisões bastante fortes, né, nesse momento de enfrentamento ao poder político, elas estão sendo cumpridas. E isso é um sinal de que as nossas instituições estão fortes. A gente tem algumas pesquisas recentes, né? Uma que foi conduzida pela própria MB, pelo ministro Luiz Felipe Salomão, que se chama Quem Somos a Magistratura que Queremos. Essa pesquisa indica que o grau de confiabilidade da população no judiciário é 2 vezes superior ao grau de confiabilidade no legislativo e no executivo. Então, demonstra que nós estamos fazendo esse papel no check and balances adequadamente, o Poder Judiciário. E uma pesquisa recente também da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, eles têm um índice de avaliação do judiciário brasileiro. Esse índice também apontou que entre os anos de 2017 e 2021, a população brasileira sentiu uma melhoria de confiança no Supremo Tribunal Federal. Esse índice saiu de 24% para 42%, o que indica também que, embora a gente esteja no meio, né, desse conflito, a população ainda procura o judiciário, ainda encontra no judiciário essa palavra final. E quanto a essa questão, finalmente, da independência judicial, também a população, nesse mesmo índice, 8 entre 10 entrevistados entendem que o Supremo Tribunal Federal não deve ser fechado, né, ou desmantelado, como algumas lideranças políticas no país têm propagado. Então, isso indica que, apesar de tudo, nós estamos cumprindo o nosso papel constitucional e que a população tem confiado nessa resposta que está sendo dada pelo judiciário brasileiro.
Thank you, Renata. A reminder that we are conducting the conversation in English, but we do have interpretation available for everyone connecting via Zoom. Bruno, I saw you nodding, and I wanted to turn it back to you, or turn it to you, because Renata mentioned something that is very key to the issue brief that we are launching today. She said that Brazilian institutions are strong, and this is something that we are also acknowledging, but that doesn't mean that they can't be strengthened and further strengthened. And that's the approach and the argument that we are taking on this issue brief that we're launching today. One of the key recommendations that we have from this issue brief is in institutionalizing norms that to ensure the independence and balance of powers. And I know that we spoke about this before as well in informing this policy in this issue brief. And I wanted to ask you about this. We mentioned in this issue brief the PGR, for example, the Prosecutor General's Office, and the Tríplice Lista Tríplice as one of the institutions that could be, one of the norms that could be institutionalized. And I wanted to ask you on what are some of the most crucial unwritten rules that should be protected immediately, and what effects will that have on Brazilian democracy in the foreseeable future?
Okay, thank you very much, Valentina, for your question. Thank you, the Atlantic Council, and also Action for Democracy, for the invitation. And I want to congratulate you for all the work you've been doing in the defense of democracy in Brazil and across the globe. And well, as we have seen in several countries and throughout history, the anti-corruption cause and anti-corruption discourse is very often hijacked by populist authoritarian forces. And that's what happened here in our country. And as soon as these forces are successful reaching power, one of the first things they do is precisely to dismantle the anti-corruption legal and institutional frameworks, because these frameworks are also the mechanisms that limits their powers and holds them accountable for their acts. So at the same time that these groups, they destroy the anti-corruption instruments, they destroy the systems of checks and balances in the country. And for the last 4 years, we have been documenting and denouncing the dismantle of the main pillars of Brazil's checks and balances systems by the Bolsonaro administrations and its allies in other powers, in the other branches of government. So beginning by the judicial pillar, the pillar of judicial accountability, this has been neutralized in a large sense by the appointment of a prosecutor general that is absolutely aligned with the government and the political class. But also moving to the political accountability pillar of the checks and balance system, the neutralization of the Congress by mechanisms like the secret budget that basically reverted all the Brazilian public investment at the federal level to the hands of congressmen without any system of transparency or accountability. And then the third pillar, the social accountability pillar, was attacked by reducing the access to information, to imposing secrecy to key information for public interest, reducing the spaces of participation, and threatening the work of civil society, the free media, etc. So I think looking ahead, what we need to focus ahead is basically to rebuild the pillars of our accountability system. So certainly to strengthen the judicial accountability pillar, we will need to discuss the reestablishment of mechanisms that secure the independence of the judiciary, but basically more focused the independence of the prosecutor general's office. We have had a successful experience with the triple list that is voted by the peers of prosecutors, the National Association of Prosecutors, that present this list to the government, and then the president can appoint and the Senate can confirm the decision. This is an important mechanism, but it's also insufficient. It's important to reestablish this practice, but there will be necessarily a debate on the accountability and the limits of the prosecutors themselves. Because whoever comes to government, if it's Bolsonaro again, probably this debate will come, but very likely if Lula comes, this debate will be key, the limits of the prosecutor's office, because Lula complains that he was target of a political persecution by Lava Jato, the prosecutors, they were acting beyond their limits, etc. So it's going to be very central, the debate next year, what the mechanisms will be put in place to put limits in the actions of the prosecutors, to set accountability for their work. But we have basically two paths to pursue in this goal. One is a very dangerous path, the path of political control of the prosecutors. That will finish to end with the independence of prosecutors. But we have an alternative path, which is the democratic control of prosecutors. And we have several proposals to do that without strangling the independence of the prosecutors. Second, moving to the political pillar of accountability, we need to focus on the extinction of the secret budget. And the ideal way to do that is the judiciary to take this role, the Supreme Court to make a decision and clearly decide on the lack of constitutionality of these mechanisms. By doing that, they will prevent a likely Lula government to have to clash with the Congress right from the beginning of its administration. So ideally, we will see a decision by the new president of the Supreme Court to put this issue into voting. Rosa Weber is the rapporteur of this case, and she maintained her role as the rapporteur of this case. And likely, we would like to see that a decision by the Supreme Court to abolish the secret budget. And finally, to conclude, the social accountability pillar needs to be reconstructed by reestablishing the access to information law, the vigency of the access to information law, reestablishment of the institutional spaces for participation, and the respect for the freedom of the press and the space for civil society and every critical voice in the country. So it's basically a work of reconstructing the pillars of our checks and balances systems beyond the topic of corruption.
Thank you, Bruno. I think that that's key and something for us to, as in the Atlantic Council and organizations like ours in SEBRI, like to look into as well in how we can be helpful in that effort. You mentioned the voice of the media, independent media, as well as civil society organizations. But one of the things that we always hear and we see that disinformation is actually a challenge for democracies worldwide. The Atlantic Council, for example, has its own center focused on disinformation, the DFR Lab, and I wanted to ask you, Alana, about this and disinformation in the Brazilian elections. We saw it playing a big role in 2018, a big role here in the United States in 2020, and again, playing a bigger role this year at the 2022 elections in Brazil. We know that the Brazilian Supreme Electoral Court has established many partnerships with social media companies to try and regulate the spread of disinformation around this electoral period. And I wanted to ask you how successful they've been. How successful has this efforts been in you from the side of the social media platform, right, from YouTube, as well as Redes Cordiais, working directly with some of the influencers and digital voices that we have in Brazil. What are what are some of the new strategies needed to make sure that we are curbing the level of disinformation?
Thank you for your question, Valentina. Good afternoon to all my colleagues that are live in DC, but also the ones that are seeing us through the Zoom. It's a big pleasure to be here, and I really want to congratulate the Atlantic Council and the other organizations that participated for the work. A dialogue like this is really important, especially having like multi-stakeholders to debate such challenging issues. But I would really like, and Valentina, thank you for bringing this question, because like you said, the TSE, the Supreme Electoral Court in Brazil, has been doing great work on building this dialogue with civil society organizations, but also with media platforms since 2014, when they started building the Fight Misinformation program in partnership with all the social media platforms, including YouTube that I represent, but also with civil society organizations. And that added a lot of value to the work we have been doing on the ground. The program has been evolving in every election. I've been here since 2020, and I've seen how the program has been evolving, not only in Brazil, because we get lessons from Brazil, but also from other countries, other markets. We learn something, those lessons are learned, we bring to the table, we improve the program, including our participation. Misinformation has moved from the marginal to the mainstream, and it seems that no topic has been immune to misinformation. We've seen that with the challenge that we face with COVID-19 crisis. So that's why one of our main goals, that's why responsibility is to fight and stop the spread of misinformation. That's one of our deepest commitment at the YouTube. So for the 2022 election, our goal is to remove fast content that violates our policies, but also to raise authoritative sources, such as the TSE itself in our platform, and provide support to voters in finding reliable and useful information so they can make an informed choice when voting. But the partnership with TSE is broader. We're also doing capacity building for the electoral court staff. We want to make sure, for example, that they knew how to use YouTube and how they can use the open platform and their voice to spread the message, spread misinformation. We also have been doing a lot of work with civil society organizations that are part of the program, including the observers from the electoral court, for them to learn our policies, learn our community guidelines. Dr. Renata Gil and IMB, for example, were here 2 weeks ago at the YouTube office in São Paulo, their team, to learn more about how to use YouTube as an open platform to also share more information. So we know that to fight misinformation, we need to make sure we're giving people more information. So we've been doing a lot on capacity building trainings, and building that dialogue with all the members of the Fighting Misinformation program. And two other things that I would like to highlight on that program that I think it's really interesting and it's really important on that pillar of raising information is the panels we have been developing in partnership with the TSE. So we recently launched 2 panels on the YouTube platform. When you look for information about the election, you're going to see in the watch page and in the video itself what we call the Election Integrity Alert Panel. It's going to take users to the TSE website where they can learn more about the integrity of the electoral process. We also have another panel that drives people to the TSE website for them to learn more about the electronic ballots itself. We know those are 2 topics that have been under discussion that are subject to misinformation. And we believe that giving people more information, it's really important to fight misinformation.
Thank you, Elena. And this is also something else that I wanted to turn a little bit the conversation into this, is that disinformation, corruption, and other factors have played a role into how confident Brazilians feel in their democratic institutions and democracy as a whole. And Feliciano, I wanted to ask you about this because youth skepticism and lack of turnout has historically been an issue for Brazilian elections, even though in Brazil we have mandatory voting, we have a very high turnout of nulls and blanks, as well as people not showing up, as well as lack of engagement beyond the electoral process. So I wanted to ask you of which policies or recommendations are most likely to re-engage young voters as well as those voters that lack the confidence and the desire to actually be politically engaged in Brazil today, and why is that? You're muted again. There you go.
I'm sorry about that. I'm so used to do Zoom and I still make this mistake every time.
2 years later,
So,
getting used to it.
Yeah, no problem. So thank you, Valentina, for your question. I have a more positive view on the issue of turnout. You mentioned that Brazil has an 80% turnout in every election. That's a very, very high margin. If you look at the history of the Brazilian election since the return to democracy in 1985, 88, depending how you calculate, our turnout is very, very high. And it is high because of the mandatory voting system, right? So some countries in the world, they had no mandatory voting. They went to mandatory. The turnout went up, and then they came back to the no mandatory voting, and the turnout went down again. So I think the current legislation for Brazil, it's well thought and well designed, because it is mandatory. The vast majority of the people go to the polls. They vote. The no's and the blanks votes are more in the legislative voting than the executive. So they are more accurate. They vote more for presidents, mayors, and governors than they do for senators, House deputies, and state deputies. And there's a mandatory voting with a very low penalty. For example, I spent 3 years in the U.S. and I missed one election. When I returned to Brazil, I had to clear my voting record in the electoral court, and I went there and I paid the fine. It was like 2 or 3 reais. Even if you don't have the money, you can forgo the penalty as well. So you have to have your voting record straight so you can do a lot of business in Brazil or work with the government or anything like that. So the system in Brazil, in terms of turnout, has been working well. There is the whole discussion if the 20% no voting, the 20% people that don't go to vote, how we can work with them to go to vote. But I think with the current system, we're doing well on this issue. But also the issue of young and how the youth and how they vote, right? If you look at the news recently, you'll see that the number of 8 to 16 years old who registered to vote broke all the records of the last elections. In Brazil, it's mandatory voting after you turn 18, but you can vote if you want if you turn up from 16 to 18 years old. So the numbers of people registering to vote has gone up. There are a lot of hypotheses for that. My interpretation is the Bolsonaro administration was so bad to the youth in Brazil that the government itself, by making its own mistakes, pushed the youth to register more to vote, right? But also, I think the most important hypothesis for that is the job well done by the electoral court in Brazil, by the TSE, the National Electoral Court, that made a tremendous job in terms of convincing the young to go to register to vote. So if there is any policy recommendation from this, I think Brazil is a role model in terms of how pushing people to vote. Other countries that have no mandatory voting should consider mandatory voting. I'm much in favor of mandatory voting. I'm totally against no mandatory voting, especially for a country that is as poor as Brazil. One of the key aspects of the positive side effects of mandatory voting is that you mandatorily include people into the policy making, because if you have mandatory voting, the poor predominantly go to vote, and you have as a candidate, as a politician, you have to target these people. You have to give them back public goods in order to get their votes in the next election. So the mandatory voting is a very important instrument to enfranchise people in Brazil, to include them in the political decision. And when and the issue of the youth and how they're voting in Brazil, I think is changing in Brazil. It's more and more people. This is one of the positive effects of having social media. So more and more people are engaged in whether it's in fake news or not. They're discussing more politics than before. So I'm from a different generation that didn't care much about politics, because I turned 16 right after the dictatorship, so democracy was already given, and democracy seemed to be given. So since it was given to us, we'll never care much if it was working or not. I think this is changing with the current administration. So just to summarize, I think I have a more positive view on that, and I'm totally in favor of the Brazilian mandatory system, and it should be strengthened and expanded worldwide. So thank you very much for this question.
Thank you so much, Feliciano, for this positive outlook. I agree with that. Actually, you mentioned inclusivity of the mandatory voting system, and we actually received a question from Humberto Collado from IRI, and I wanted to ask it to Renata, Dr. Renata Gil, because we spoke about gender-based violence before. And one of the things that we see is that in Brazil, the majority of the electorate is actually female, it's women, but that's not reflected in politics in general. So what role can gender play in further strengthening democracy in Brazil, and what are some opportunities in Brazilian politics for them? I think that this also goes into the issue of violence against women in politics in general. If you could speak a little bit more to that and this new legislation that we have in place for these upcoming elections too.
Bem, esse é meu tema preferido, né? Falar sobre inclusão, falar sobre gênero e tudo que tem acontecido no Brasil. Aliás, a gente está nesse momento discutindo uma violência que aconteceu, que não é uma violência política, mas em razão da política. Uma jornalista brasileira foi agredida por um militante, por um deputado, e esse deputado já está, pelo que eu ouvi hoje na mídia, com 8 processos de pedido, né, de cassação no Conselho de Ética na Assembleia Legislativa. O fato é que nós, no Brasil, sofremos do mesmo mal que o mundo tem sofrido, né? A violência de gênero, ela também entra na violência política, ela também entra na política. A gente percebe que muitas mulheres sofrem violência política e o Brasil acabou de disciplinar esse tema. A gente aprovou uma lei que criminaliza a violência política. Eu mesma, como presidente da AMB, essa associação gigantesca de juízes, eu estive em algumas diligências com o governo federal no interior da Bahia, no Recôncavo Baiano, em que uma prefeita teve seus 2 correligionários assassinados brutalmente e ela ameaçadíssima de morte, porque naquele local sempre houve uma eleição do coronelismo local masculino. Então, a gente vê muita dificuldade ainda nessa ascensão feminina, nessa inclusão, né? Como o Feliciano falou, eu acho que a inclusão ela só vai ser completa se nós tivermos os representantes e estivermos participando desse processo político. Não tem como você alijar um determinado segmento, e isso vale para todos os outros, né? A população negra, o povo preto, todas as pessoas que precisam dessa representação. E o que nós temos visto é que quanto mais pessoas das minorias nas lideranças, quanto mais mulheres, por exemplo, eu que sou representante aí do grupo feminino, né? Quanto mais mulheres a gente coloca nos cargos de liderança, mais decisões com perspectiva de gênero a gente tem, mais políticas de gênero a gente tem. Eu mesma apresentei, como presidente da AMB, um pacote legislativo chamado Pacote Basta, que foi aprovada em 4 meses em ambas as casas, na Câmara, no Senado, e sancionada em solenidade oficial pelo presidente da República, criminalizando a violência psicológica no Brasil, algo que estava lá há mais de 7 anos nas prateleiras do Congresso Nacional, e criando uma política pública nacional, que é a campanha Sinal Vermelho, aquele X vermelho que as mulheres apresentam, e com esse sinal elas são socorridas de qualquer tipo de violência em razão do gênero. Então, a gente tem uma endemia de violência no Brasil pelo gênero, né? O Brasil é o 5º país que mais mata mulheres no mundo, só fica atrás de Rússia, Guatemala, Venezuela, Honduras, países que não cumprem tratados de direitos humanos. Então, a nossa posição nesse ranking é mais vergonhosa ainda, mas a gente tem caminhado, tanto com a reforma da legislação, e aí só nesse ano nós tivemos mais de 140 projetos de lei aprovados com relação à pauta de gênero, dando mais densidade à Lei Maria da Penha, que é a nossa lei que foi oriunda de uma condenação internacional do Brasil pela Corte Interamericana de Direitos Humanos, mas também melhorando a condição de acesso, né, combatendo a violência política, como esse projeto que foi apresentado pela deputada Margarete Coelho, que acabou vencedor. Nós, como entidade da sociedade, né, civil, nós estamos propulsionando algumas políticas. Então, por exemplo, agora nós apresentamos ao TSE, quando da indicação da ministra substituta, um pedido de lista tríplice só de mulheres, e o ministro Barroso acolheu isso quando presidente do TSE, e foi escolhida, então, a ministra Maria Cláudia, e isso foi, né, uma movimentação que a gente tem feito. Eu tenho pedido que as listas de OAB, que as listas que têm sido apresentadas tanto nos tribunais eleitorais como nos tribunais de justiça, elas contemplem mulheres, para que essa igualdade seja atingida, e a gente tem, então, os exemplos que inibem a violência que tem sido praticada. Eu acho que não dependemos só das decisões judiciais afirmativas oriundas das ações judiciais afirmativas. Nós precisamos, como sociedade, praticar essas ações afirmativas. E movimentos como esse, como pedido de lista tríplice, como pedidos de colocação de mais mulheres em cargos de liderança, passam uma mensagem para a sociedade de que as mulheres podem e devem ocupar, né, os lugares, e que elas promovam, então, as políticas públicas que vão trazer essa igualdade. Eu acho que quando nós tivermos uma perspectiva melhor de igualdade de gênero, nós teremos inexoravelmente uma perspectiva de diminuição da violência contra a mulher, levando em consideração que nós temos ainda, né, a questão do pensamento patriarcal. Isso é uma coisa que é estrutural, né, e que precisa de políticas estruturantes para que a gente debele esse grande mal. Mas eu tenho, como eu disse, eu sou otimista, eu tenho visto que o Brasil tem caminhado nessa direção da diminuição. Ainda é uma diminuição muito simples, muito simplória. O último dado do Fórum Brasileiro de Segurança Pública indica uma diminuição de 1,7% dos feminicídios nesse ano de 2021, quando a gente implementou as políticas públicas como a Sinal Vermelho e algumas outras políticas públicas nacionais. Houve um aumento, no caso, nos registros de ocorrência de violência contra a mulher, de 17%, e um aumento de 12% nas medidas protetivas aplicadas. Então, isso também nos mostra que alguma coisa está funcionando, ainda não suficiente para a gente promover a igualdade de gênero e diminuir essa violência, tanto política como violência institucional, que as mulheres têm sofrido.
Obrigada, Renata. Thank you so much. Our time is almost up, unfortunately, because I have a list here of questions that I still wanted to cover and ask. But to wrap up, I think that Renata mentioned the gender issue, and I wanted to go back to each one of you and ask you for a brief comment on we are 3 weeks away from the first round of elections in Brazil happening on October 2nd. What is one topic that you are watching and following closely and that you would suggest that we all do too? I'll start with you, Bruno.
Of course, I'm going to defend here my area of work, and Of course, anti-corruption is key for this moment here. Some people say that this is not as important topic as it was in 2018 elections, but everyone that watched the first television debate, the presidential debate, saw that the word corruption came up 43 times, and together with women were the two most debated topics at the presidential election. So I think we need to see, again, to re-strengthen the fight against corruption, but in another approach, an approach for what it truly means, a fight for rights. So it needs to be reshaped as a cause that respects and promotes rights and connected to other very central issues to the world today. For example, climate change. In Brazil, 98% of deforestation is illegal deforestation. So fighting climate change in Brazil, it's a matter of rule of law. No poverty, inequality, security, all these issues are deeply connected to the issues of rule of law, of fighting criminality, fighting corruption. So I think what we need is to recover, to rescue the fight against corruption, but to give it another lens, another approach, which is a rights approach to the fight against corruption.
Okay, so corruption and rule of law. Feliciano.
Thank you, Valentina. I'm going to do just like Bruno did. I'm going to defend my ground here, and I'm sure Renata and Alana will do the same. So I think I'll be very happy to see the Atlantic Council organizing with Action for Democracy organizing a panel after the first round of elections about the future of Brazil's foreign policy, right, and the role of Brazil in the world. Right? The other day, I was talking to a foreign diplomat who was asking me, what did I think about the election? Who was going to win? And I said, look, I think it's likely that Lula will win, but it's totally possible that Bolsonaro wins. So it's impossible to predict. Somehow Lula has more chances, but Bolsonaro also has chances. And he was saying that in his continent, he was from Europe, he said everybody believes that Lula already won, and Brazil will be accepted again as a credible partner in world affairs. And I think this is obviously wrong. I think the election it's uncertain, especially because we're going to have a runoff. And depending who will win and what type of foreign policy that person will implement in Brazil, that will shape our future in terms of the world, the role of Brazil in the world for the next coming years. I think with the increasing rivalry between superpowers, between the United States, China, and Russia, Brazil has to have a very sophisticated foreign policy that prevents Brazil from choosing sides in this coming rivalry. It will be very wrong for Brazil to choose one side or another. So, and I think if Bolsonaro wins, based on the 4 years of his administration, the foreign policy he implemented, Brazil might make a terrible mistake. So I think foreign policy and the role of Brazil in the world for the next 10 years should be a very important panel for the Atlantic Council to discuss in the next, right after the first round. Thank you very much, Valentina, and thank you again for the opportunity of speaking here. It's a pleasure to meet Renata, Bruno, and Alana on this panel. Hope to see you and talk to you in the future, in Portuguese.
In Portuguese. Thank you, Feliciano. So I invite everyone to continue following the work of the Atlantic Council because we have that coming. Alana, next is you.
Thank you. So me and different teams are closely monitoring misinformation, working quickly to remove content that violates our policies and that could cause real world harm, such as violent extremism. And we'll stay vigilant ahead of, during, and after the election day. So misinformation is my concern right now.
Renata.
Então, a minha preocupação é exatamente o fortalecimento do sistema judicial, independência judicial, é o desafio do mundo, depois do que fez El Salvador com os seus magistrados, né? Depois do que fez a Polônia, depois do que está tentando fazer Angola, com seus juízes também, é o meu desafio, e acho que a gente tem aí uma proteção institucional e constitucional potente para fazer valer essa independência judicial. Muito obrigada.
Obrigada, obrigada a todos, muito obrigada. Thank you, Bruno. Thank you, Feliciano. Thank you, Alana. Thank you, Renata. I would say let's also keep watching the legislative elections as well as state-level elections, because we're electing not only president, but state-level representatives too, and congressional representatives. With that, I invite all of you to join us and please read our issue brief that we just launched today. It's available on our website, as well as you should have received a link on the Zoom chat as well. Thank you so much for joining us and for tuning in. Thank you to our speakers, and have a good day.